It's raining like more today than I think it has all year combined, which is good. I mean, it won't cure the drought, but any rain is good, and I think the mountains are getting snow, so that's good. Today I'm going to go through the podcast that I'm currently caught up on. We will start with Nerdist. Nerdist is a pretty popular podcast, I'd say. It's hosted by Chris Hardwick. It also has the co-hosts of Matt Myra and Jonah Ray. They just interview celebrities and other people that aren't necessarily celebrities, or they'll have hostful podcasts, and I just really like it. I really like Chris Hardwick, and it can be a little explicit, but it's my kind of humor. Next we have Hello Internet, and this is from the two YouTubers CPG Gray and Brady Heron of Number File, Computer File, periodic videos, and other projects. And I really like this one. It's a two dudes talking podcast, but I just like what their conversations are about, and they have pretty opposing views. Although they are friends, they just look at life a little differently, and I really enjoy listening to them. Next we have a podcast that I'm pretty sure isn't uploaded anymore, but I just haven't had the heart to delete it, and that's Chainsaw Suit Podcast. This is hosted by Chris Straub. He's a comic writer, Chainsaw Suit comic, and it's also hosted by Mikey Newman, who wrote the first Borderlands and does writing and video game stuff. He works for Gearbox, and this was their first podcast together that was just kind of conversations and sometimes and sketches and fake commercials and just funniness. Their new podcast is called Morning Rush with Chris and Mikey, and it's kind of in the format of a morning radio show. They do still have segments that are like the original podcast, so it's good. Next is Jonah Radio, and this is from Jonah Ray, who's on The Nerdist also, and they play music. They have music guests or guests that have some kind of passion for music, and it's really funny, super random, but there's so many references from that podcast that I say in real life, and no one knows what I'm talking about. I went to their live show during SF Sketchfest, and it was awesome. Next is Pop My Culture Podcast. This is hosted by Cole Stratton and Vanessa Ragland, and they talk a lot about pop culture and what's going on and their input. I really agree most of the time with their viewings of mainstream pop culture. And then they'll have on a guest, either a person who, you know, was a star of a show in the 90s or early aughts or even earlier, or a current star, usually kind of smaller known people. But I really like this podcast. They're just really funny, and I like their point of view, and the guests they have on, their interaction with the guests is always very interesting. Next we have Phoebe, and this is hosted by Matt Myra of Nerdist podcast and now other things, such as a writer for At Midnight, and also Scott Mosier. This is another two dudes talking, but they are just so hilarious. They have so many funny bits, like the Canadian sniper bit is probably like my favorite of all times, but I really like Phoebe. It doesn't come out very often, but when it does, it's such a gem, and I listen to it right away. Next we have the JV Club that's hosted by Janet Varney, and Janet Varney is just awesome. She's so amazing and so insightful and funny, and just I love her. This podcast just has her interviewing women about growing up, specifically their teenage years. I would say they focus on the most. It's really cool hearing these women's stories, and they are often very different, but these are now successful women, mostly in the LA area, and, you know, actress, writer, that kind of deal. But it's just really interesting to hear people's backstories. Next we have Joy the Baker podcast, and this is also with Tracy Shutterbean. They're both food bloggers, and I really enjoy their food vlogginess. And this podcast is like the two chicks talking, but they're so funny and just random, and I love listening to conversations, and sometimes they're a little ridiculous, but that's why we love them. Next is Harmontown, which is a live show that's hosted by Dan Harmon of Community fame and Jeff Daniels of Whose Line Is It Anyway? Harmontown's like an experience. There's a documentary on Netflix about it if you ever wonder kind of what Harmontown's about, but it's a podcast, a live show, and Dan and Jeff usually have guests on. They just kind of talk about their feelings and that kind of stuff, and then they play D&D at the end, and that's the only really description. I'm actually going to my first live show next weekend, May 3rd, for my birthday, and I am so excited. Next we have the Alton Brown cast, and this one doesn't get updated much recently, but it's hosted by Alton Brown, and he talks about different food world things and other things. Next is Slumber Party with Ali and Georgia. This is another one that as soon as it's uploaded, I listen to it right away. They are just so funny. Again, kind of like Joy the Baker, they're a little ridiculous sometimes. They will ask slumber party questions like ghost stories or, what's your guilty pleasure midnight snack. And so they usually have a guest on, and it's great. Next is Welcome to Night Vale, which is another very popular podcast. It's a story told about the town Night Vale where crazy stuff happens. Pretty sure most people at least have heard of Welcome to Night Vale. Same with This American Life. This is an NPR show. It comes out every Sunday in podcast form, and stories, usually about 3 to 4 stories. So This American Life is pretty common. Now, talk about common, we have Serial, which is huge. So since going into that, I'm pretty sure anyone who has internet connection has heard of Serial. Next we have Not Too Deep with Grace Helbig. Grace Helbig being a YouTuber, and this is her podcast where she goes not too deep with guests, usually from the YouTube world. Although I think second season expands a little because I'm pretty sure Chris Hardwick's going to be on that podcast. Looking forward to that. Next we have The Indoor Kids with Kumail Nanjiani and Emily Gordon, who are like two of my favorite couple. They're just amazing. And this is mainly supposed to be about video games, but sometimes they talk about things other than video games, and I just really like their viewpoints and learning about video games. TLDR is a short podcast on internet stories, so kind of like TLDR, so kind of like the summary of internet things. It doesn't really come out that often anymore, but I do like listening to it. There's some interesting stories. Next we have Lies with Sarah Schaefer. This one also doesn't come out very often, but it's her and a guest, and the guest will tell a fake story about them, like they're an expert in something random and weird, and yeah, it's kind of funny. Really short, so easy listen. Next is one of my new favorites of recent times, and that's How Tall Discussion Series with Moshe Kasher. This podcast, it's a live show, and they'll have one expert on a subject and then 3 comedians, and so the experts telling the comedians about their topic, and then the comedians are kind of riffing and also asking questions, and it's amazing. I love it. Next we have Star Talk Radio with Neil deGrasse Tyson, and most recently Bill Nye's been filling in a lot for Neil deGrasse Tyson, so it's usually them and a comedian, and then they have guests of different types, either scientists or celebrities or something, but it's all usually revolving around science and space, and it's interesting. Next is This Feels Terrible with Erin McGathy, and this one actually hasn't really been updated that recently, but it's a podcast about breakups, and she has different people on. They tell a story about breakups, and it's just really interesting and sometimes kind of funny to laugh at people's pains. That sounds awful. Moving on. Next is Invisibilia. This is another popular one from NPR, and it's about these hidden things in the world that affect things, and I guess that's a horrible way to describe it, but kind of more of like a NPR Radio Lab show. It's really interesting. The first season has wrapped up, so waiting patiently for the second season. Next we have a podcast I found while I was randomly scrolling through iTunes one day, and that's Nerdette, and I absolutely love it. It's hosted by these 2 awesome chicks, and they'll interview different people, and even people like Emily Grosley from Brain Scoop, and I think even Hank Green was on this one. They also interviewed Chris Hadfield once. Pretty short, but I just like what they talk about, and they give good recommendations on TV shows and books and other pop culture things. Next to the podcast, I actually know the person, so this is Mike Podcast Not So Average, and he interviews different people. So far it's been from like the Muay Thai fighting, I guess it was a power lifter, basically his friends or people he's met because of Muay Thai, but they just talk about their hobby and whatnot, and it's super interesting and you learn a lot, and I think that's mainly why I listen to podcasts, is to learn about things. Next we have Reply All, and this is stories about the internet. I think I said that for TLDR. I don't know how to differentiate. Basically, the people that started TLDR then left TLDR to start Reply All. So Reply All is maybe a little bit more internet-y focused, but I do appreciate it. Next we have Human Conversations with Erin McGathy and Wayne Fetterman. And this one is these two people talking, and they don't use computers to ever look up anything, so sometimes their conversations get pretty ridiculous, but it's interesting. And they, again, are at two different points of life and have different viewpoints, and so I like those conversations. Next we have Wait, Wait, Don't Tell Me, another pretty famous, popular, whatever, NPR show, trivia show, and I mainly listen to that to prepare for pub quiz. Because they'll ask questions about recent topics, and it's just a good way to get my mind prepared for pub quiz. Then we have the Pro You podcast, and this is hosted by two trainers. One of the trainers who trains Chris Hardwick is a co-host on this, and they just talk about healthy living. I like their way they approach things and how you build a training plan, and it's more of a lifestyle instead of like this diet or this, strict thing, and how you work things into your lifestyle. And just, it's a good listen. I sometimes like to listen to this podcast on runs because I feel very like mindfulness. Now we have This Is Rad with Kyle Clark and Matthew Burnside. I found out by both of these people through other podcasts, Kyle Clark from Nerd Nerdist and Matthew Burnside from The Indoor Kids. Then I realized they had a podcast together, and it was like the best discovery ever. So each episode they talk about something that is rad. I've been trying to catch up on the backlogged episodes, so now I have 5 left, and I'm super excited that I'm almost all caught up. So yeah, This Is Rad is pretty rad. Another one that I'm catching up on is Good Job Brain, and this is another pub quiz kind of one to get me ready for that, except not as current news, just general knowledge, and it's a really good one to listen to and just learn stuff. Like, I learned what the 4 H's in 4-H means. It's heads, hearts, hands, help. So, hey, that's good. The rest of the podcasts I have here aren't downloaded, but it's all the ones that I someday want to catch up on. And this is where you start to realize that, like, yeah, I might be a little addicted because I have all these backlogged. So, yikes. One day I'll catch up to all of them. Hopefully. Those are the podcasts I listen to. Sorry this is a little long, but hey, I've been wanting to do this. If you have any questions about any of these, some are more explicit than others and different, but if you were looking for some podcasts that sound interesting, feel free to ask me some questions. I'd be glad to go into further detail or give you some recommendations based on like what you like. That's all. Bye!